Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The sun beat down heavily that morning as Anulika stood barefoot at the overgrown edge of the village cemetery, her small hands clutching a wilted bouquet. She was 6 years old, eyes wide with questions too heavy for her young mind, staring down at the mound of soil that covered her mother. No one held her hand. Her father, Mr. Okafor, stood in silence, his face blank from grief, his eyes distant. The mourners trickled away, muttering empty condolences, and soon it was just the wind, the dirt, and the child who no longer had a mother. That night she curled up in her mother's wrapper, waiting for her to come back, but she never did. In the days that followed, Anulika learned the silence of loss, the way people avoid looking at orphans like they might catch their misfortune. Her father, once loving, began returning home late, speaking less, and avoiding her gaze. Her world narrowed to the chores she could do, and the memories she tried not to forget. It wasn't long before Cordelia arrived, her father's new wife. The woman came into their lives, as if she were a long-lost queen returning to claim her throne. Dressed in expensive lace and smelling of perfume too sharp for the village breeze, Cordelia carried herself with an authority that unsettled even the birds. She smiled, but it never reached her eyes. "I'll take care of everything now," she said in a voice coated with sugary venom. At first, Anulika tried to be hopeful. She remembered fairy tales about kind stepmothers and imagined having someone to plait her hair again or sing her to sleep. But reality had sharper edges. Cordelia wasted no time establishing her rule. Anulika was stripped of her room and sent to sleep on a mat near the kitchen. Her favorite doll disappeared. Her mother's wrapper was taken and used to wash rags. "You're not a child anymore," Cordelia would say, though Anulika was barely 7. And her father? He watched, but he never interfered. Silence became his only language. As the years passed, the house transformed. Cordelia bore 2 daughters, Jinika and Chidinma, loud, spoiled, and trained in their mother's likeness. They were dressed like porcelain dolls and praised for things Anulika had done in secret. While they danced and played, Anulika scrubbed floors, fetched water, and served food she wasn't allowed to taste first. Cordelia praised her own children for being civilized, and insulted Anulika for being too quiet, too dark, too serious. Anulika learned that in this house, the only reward for kindness was more burden. Still, she said nothing. She kept her head down and focused on school, the only space where she felt safe. Her teachers loved her. They saw brilliance in her, the way she grasped concepts and wrote with the wisdom of someone twice her age. But when she brought home awards, Cordelia called them useless paper. It wasn't just neglect anymore, it was resentment. And as Anulika grew more beautiful with each passing year, Cordelia's hatred turned from subtle bitterness into something far more dangerous. By the time Anulika turned 13, the house no longer tried to hide its cruelty. Cordelia had trained her daughters not just to ignore Anulika, but to despise her. Jinika, the eldest, was sharp-tongued and manipulative. Chidinma was more reckless, always eager to follow her sister's lead. When Cordelia went to work or stepped out for market errands, the true horrors of Anulika's world revealed themselves. They slapped her for fun, poked her head with sharp pencils when she wasn't fast enough, and even urinated in buckets and told her to clean it up, then called her filthy. Once, when Anulika mistakenly spilled pap on Jinika's white sandals, they dragged her outside and made her kneel in gravel under the afternoon sun, recording her while they mocked her accent. "Say I'm a bush girl who doesn't know how to serve madam," Jinika had ordered, phone camera aimed like a weapon. And Anulika, trembling, had said it. Because the alternative was a beating. Cordelia never asked questions, because she didn't want to know the answers. If Anulika limped or cried, Cordelia would slap her again for being dramatic. "Maybe you need to be beaten into sense," she once hissed. It was in these moments that Anulika truly understood what it meant to be voiceless, to live among people who not only wished you harm, but expected you to thank them afterward. When visitors came, the whole household played perfect. Cordelia bragged about raising 3 girls, and how united they were. Jinika would wrap an arm around Anulika's shoulder and smile through gritted teeth. It was a show. And when the doors shut again, the beatings resumed, now laced with laughter. "You think you're better than us?" Chidinma would spit. "You think you'll escape this house?" Sometimes Anulika believed she wouldn't. But in the deepest part of her spirit, there was something unbroken, a quiet flame that whispered, "Survive." Books became her escape. While others slept, Anulika read by moonlight or the glow of a borrowed flashlight. She devoured novels, solved equations, and taught herself how to write eloquently. Her brilliance became impossible to hide. Teachers visited the house, hoping to speak with her parents about scholarships and competitions. Cordelia waved them off. "We're not interested in sending her anywhere," she'd say, forcing Anulika to serve drinks and exit the room. But word spread. Anulika became known as the silent genius. Friends were forbidden from speaking to her. Cordelia warned their mothers she had dark spirits. Still, Anulika pressed forward. For every slap, she read a chapter. For every insult, she learned a new word. And though the bruises on her back faded, the knowledge she carried stayed. She would escape. She just didn't know when or how. University was meant to be a fresh start, but for Anulika, it became another battlefield. Cordelia made it clear. Anulika would attend the same university as her stepsisters, not because she wanted her to succeed, but so she could remain under their control. "You will be our house help there too," Jinika had whispered the day they all packed. True to her word, the bullying followed Anulika onto campus. In the shared off-campus accommodation arranged by Cordelia, Anulika was treated worse than a maid. She was forced to cook, clean, and do laundry for all three of them. If she refused, they would unplug her phone charger, pour water on her notes, or report lies to the house agent about her behavior. "You're nothing without us," Chidinma sneered. "You'd be in the village if it weren't for Mummy." The psychological torment was even more cutting. Jinika and Chidinma told everyone in their department that Anulika was mentally disturbed. They whispered she was a bedwetter who had seizures at night. People began to avoid sitting next to her. In group work, she was excluded. Even lecturers, misled by rumors, dismissed her contributions. She spent her days in silence, sitting alone at the back of lecture halls, trying not to cry. What hurt most was that no one asked her if it was true. They simply believed the loudest voices. Her stepsisters ruled the hostel like queens, while Anulika was invisible, unless she was being humiliated. Once, Jinika emptied her dirty clothes into Anulika's bed and filmed her reaction. The video went viral in their private group chat. "Servant girl finally breaks," they captioned it. Yet, even in the pit of their cruelty, Anulika never lost her mind. In fact, she remained top of her class. Her essays were praised anonymously by lecturers who never realized the brilliant voice behind those works was the same girl they overlooked daily. She won a departmental essay competition and used the prize money to buy herself a small study lamp and data for research. Though mocked and degraded, her mind soared. And it was this brilliance, buried beneath bandages of pain, that would one day save her. But for now, she carried her pain like luggage, heavy and unwanted, following her from classroom to home, from morning to night, waiting for the day she could finally set it down and breathe freely. It was in the second semester of her second year that Anulika met Chaik. He was everything the others weren't, kind without expecting anything, brilliant in his own right, and the only person who spoke to her without suspicion or mockery. He first noticed her during a heated class debate where Anulika, tired of being underestimated, raised her hand and dismantled an entire argument with calm intelligence and firm logic. Chaik had been impressed, not just with her words, but with the fire in her eyes. Over time, he began to sit near her, asking if she'd like help printing lecture notes or if she needed study materials. At first, Anulika was suspicious, used to kindness as a trap. But Chaik never crossed any lines, never asked anything inappropriate. Slowly, she began to open up. They studied together in the library, shared meat pies between lectures, and laughed quietly under mango trees between classes. For the first time in years, Anulika felt like a girl, not a servant. She started writing again, short poems about strength, pain, and fragile hope. And when she showed one to Chike, he smiled and said, "You're more than just beautiful. You're a revolution." But good things never lasted in Anulika's world, especially when her stepsisters noticed she was happy. One afternoon, Jinika walked into their room, waving Chike's photo on her phone. "He's fine, Shah," she said to Chidinma. "Let's see how long her fairy tale lasts." From that day, the plan was set in motion. Jinika began showing up where Chike was, laughing too loud, pretending to bump into him on purpose, planting suggestions that she and Anulika had grown apart due to family madness. Slowly, she began to twist the truth. She told him Anulika once tried to take her own life. She showed him old videos of Anulika crying, taken in moments of trauma, and said she had episodes. Chike, confused and caught off guard, started to pull away. Anulika noticed. His replies were delayed, his eyes filled with worry instead of warmth. Then, the final blow, Jinika lied and told him Anulika was under psychiatric medication and had tried to harm herself when she suspected he didn't love her enough. She even forged hospital reports, and Chike, overwhelmed and unsure, ghosted Anulika completely. 1 week later, Anulika walked into the cafeteria and saw them. Jinika sitting on Chike's lap, laughing with her hands around his neck. Her heart dropped. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the public way it was done, as if her pain was a spectacle. Students laughed when she passed, whispering, "She said he's hers, but he chose better." Anulika didn't cry, not in public. She carried her tray and left, straight-faced, but her insides trembled like glass. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "Even butterflies burn if they fly too close to fire. But I am not ashes. I am smoke that rises." It became her prayer. She knew then that her sisters would not stop until they broke her completely. But she also knew she could not give them that satisfaction. She folded her pain like a letter and stored it deep inside her chest. The dream of being loved? She buried it. But the dream of becoming more than her pain? That she let live. The months that followed were both the darkest and the most defining for Anulika. After the humiliation with Chike, her stepsisters grew bolder in their cruelty, sensing her emotional collapse. They taunted her about the breakup, printing memes with fake WhatsApp chats and sharing them in group chats. Chike chose light over darkness, one message read, mocking her skin tone and sadness. But where most would have broken, Anulika found an unlikely anchor in her mind. She immersed herself completely in academics, burying herself in books, solving equations like puzzles, and volunteering for every departmental project that needed help. Her professors noticed. One in particular, Mrs. Benifo, an older lecturer with a calm voice and discerning eyes, took interest in her. After class one day, she called her aside and said, "I've been watching you, Anulika. You're fighting something big, but you're not letting it win. Keep going." It was the first time in years anyone had spoken to her as if she mattered. Anulika's academic growth became a shield. She began tutoring younger students in private, using the money to buy personal hygiene items and save small amounts weekly. She joined online communities for young writers and began submitting essays under a pseudonym. One piece titled "The Skin They Feared Was Brilliant" was published on a student blog and went viral. People didn't know it was her, but the words gave her peace. She was finally speaking, even if anonymously. Mrs. Benifo encouraged her to apply for academic fellowships abroad, and though she didn't yet have the resources, Anulika kept applying. "One day you'll leave this place," the lecturer would whisper when handing her printed articles. "Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. This place won't define you." Slowly, Anulika began to believe that. Her stepsisters still mocked her, but their words had less impact. She had built a wall of intellect and self-awareness too high for their pettiness to reach. It was during this time she met Obina, a student volunteer for a local NGO that supported disadvantaged girls in tertiary institutions. He was assigned to document case studies for a scholarship campaign, and when he stumbled upon Anulika's name during a lecturer's recommendation list, he insisted on meeting her. Their first conversation was cautious. Anulika didn't trust easily. But Obina was patient. He never asked about her scars or the bruises she covered with powder. Instead, he asked what she wanted to become in life. A woman they can't ignore, she replied. He smiled and said, then let's start building her. Over time, their interactions grew into something soft, fragile, and essential. Not romantic, not yet, but deeply human. Obina saw what others didn't. He saw the light in her eyes. A light that refused to be put out, no matter how dark the world became. At home, things were falling apart, though Cordelia pretended otherwise. Mr. Okafor, Anulika's father, had grown visibly weak. His once strong shoulders now sagged beneath his caftans, and his skin looked sallow and dry. At first, they blamed stress. Work is killing him, Cordelia would say with a false concern that even the neighbors no longer believed. But the truth was far more sinister. Every night, Cordelia prepared his evening tea herself, insisting that no one else touch it. She added a small dose of powdered poison prescribed by a friend of hers who knew how to handle stubborn husbands. At first, it was subtle: headaches, fatigue, slight nausea. But within months, he began forgetting things. Then came the shaking hands, the chest pains, and the unexplained vomiting. Doctors ran tests, but found nothing conclusive. Cordelia cried fake tears at the hospital, and then smiled wickedly when no one was watching. She had a plan, and it required Mr. Okafor to vanish. Anulika sensed something wasn't right. Her father, though never very attentive, had started calling her into his room late at night, whispering apologies. I failed you. I should have protected you, he'd mumble, often too weak to lift his hand. One night, as she fed him watery pap, he grabbed her wrist tightly and said, you must be free. Don't die here. It was the first time she saw regret in his eyes. She began to suspect her stepmother was doing something, but every time she hinted at it, Cordelia would slap her and say, are you calling me a witch? She banned Anulika from entering her father's room again, claiming he needed rest. But Anulika began sneaking in while Cordelia was out. She noticed the change in the color of the tea, the smell of the water jug, and the strange pills her father wasn't prescribed. When she tried to alert a nurse at the hospital, Cordelia quickly moved him to a private home facility and banned outside visitors. We're taking care of him now, she told everyone, but Anulika knew better. She watched her father die in slow motion and was helpless to stop it. On the morning of Anulika's 19th birthday, Mr. Okafor died. Cordelia wore white and wailed louder than anyone else at the funeral. My husband, my king, she shouted, collapsing into the arms of fake sympathizers. Jinika and Chidinma wore black lace and cried crocodile tears. But Anulika stood still, unmoved, her heart shivering beneath her skin. Her father had died not just of poison, but of cowardice, of guilt, of silence. After the burial, the will was read, and Cordelia had manipulated it to her favor. The house, the land, the savings, all in her name. Anulika's name was nowhere to be found. That night, she returned home to find her room emptied. Cordelia stood at the door and said, you're lucky I'm not throwing you out completely. From now on, you sleep in the kitchen. And if you dare raise your voice, I'll remind you you're nothing but a stray child. And so began Anulika's descent into a house with no mercy, a house that was never a home, ruled by women who wanted her erased. But something inside her had changed. Her pain was now purpose, and her silence was gathering strength. The night before her 19th birthday, Anulika sat cross-legged on the cold kitchen floor, folding her father's last shirt, the one Cordelia hadn't sold or burned. The fabric still held the faint scent of his cologne, and with trembling fingers, she brought it close to her face. That day, Cordelia had stormed through the house, shouting at funeral guests to remove their shoes and accusing the maid of stealing candles. The air was heavy with mourning, but none of it was for Anulika. In that house, her father's death felt less like a loss and more like a door slamming shut, final, cold, and intentional. She was now fully alone. The walls that once echoed with her mother's laughter had become hollowed-out prisons filled with mockery, sarcasm, and silence. When night fell, She lit a candle she'd hidden for emergencies and placed it by her chest. Her eyes remained dry, but her soul shivered in the quiet. That night she didn't sleep. The next morning, her birthday, Cordelia stood in the center of the living room with a smug smile. She dressed in all white, not in respect, but in arrogance, looking like a widow preparing for a victory parade. 19 years of ungrateful existence, she scoffed as Anulika walked past. Don't expect anything. Not cake. Not blessings. You are a mistake this house regrets. Chidinma laughed and shoved a broom into her arms. Clean the sitting room, she snapped. Visitors are coming. Anulika said nothing. She picked up the broom and swept slowly, letting the tears fall quietly into the dustpan. That afternoon, she was banned from attending the extended family's post-burial gathering. Instead, she was sent to buy drinks and stay outside in the heat. For hours, she sat on a stool under the orange tree, fanning herself with an old newspaper, while her stepsisters gossiped and drank inside. That night, Cordelia locked the door and pretended to forget Anulika outside. She slept on the veranda, curled up with a sack of charcoal. But the cruelest part of that day wasn't what they said or did, it was what they didn't. Her father's final words had meant something. Anulika couldn't stop replaying them. You must be free. Don't die here. He had whispered it, as if he'd known what they were planning, as if the guilt had grown so large it refused to let him leave in peace. She thought of the moments she'd caught him watching her, eyes filled with regret, lips sealed shut. He had known. He had seen it all and done nothing. And now, his silence had left her surrounded by enemies and ghosts. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Anulika crept into the backyard and buried her father's last shirt under the mango tree. Rest now, she whispered, hands trembling. I won't die here. I promise. It was her vow. From that day forward, something shifted in her spirit. Not strength, not yet, but resolve. The kind of resolve that grows only after you've been broken so completely. Even the pieces don't remember what wholeness felt like. The days after her father's burial blurred into one long stretch of cruelty. Cordelia no longer hid her disdain. With no father to pretend for, she unleashed her venom without restraint. You are nothing but a mistake your father refused to correct, she said one morning as she flung Anulika's only good blouse into the fire. You think intelligence will save you? Let's see how you study without electricity. That same week, she cut off power access to the room Anulika now slept in, a dusty corner of the kitchen beside the kerosene stove. The scent of gas clung to her skin. Her phone charger was confiscated. Her study lamp was broken. The only light she had came from matches and the moon. When it rained, water dripped from the ceiling, soaking her mat and school notes. She was no longer a daughter in that house, just a prisoner, bound by blood and grief. Jinika and Chidinma found new joy in inventing humiliations. They made her wash their underwear, massage their feet after school, and kneel to greet them even when no one was watching. One night, when Anulika failed to iron Jinika's dress properly, Chidinma poured cold water on her face as she slept. You're lucky it's not acid, she said, smirking. Another time, they accused Anulika of stealing a slice of cake and forced her to drink salt water until she vomited. And still, she said nothing. The neighbors heard whispers. The woman who sold Gary across the road once asked, Anulika, are you okay? But she smiled and said, Yes, Auntie. I'm fine. Because what could she say? That she was the ghost of a girl who still lived in a house that wanted her dead? She carried her silence like armor, praying it would shield her from madness. Yet, through all of it, Anulika clung to her brilliance. School became her lifeline. Despite the late nights, the punishments, and the fatigue, she never missed a class. She sat in the front row, even when people avoided her. Her notes remained pristine. Her answers in lectures stunned even the most arrogant of professors. Her intelligence became a form of rebellion, a protest against those who thought they'd buried her spirit. When she scored the highest GPA in her department, Cordelia didn't celebrate. Instead, she tore the result sheet and spat. All that brain and still no husband. Who will marry a cursed girl? But Anulika didn't respond. She simply tucked a copy of her result into a brown envelope and hid it beneath her pillow. One day, she whispered to herself, this paper will open the door they locked. And with each passing night, she dreamed of freedom, not just from the house, but from the history that tried to kill her name. It was a rainy Monday morning when the university announced a national beauty pageant sponsored by a renowned cosmetics brand. Posters were plastered all over campus. Natural is powerful. Enter to represent your roots. The contest wasn't just about looks. It was about grace, intellect, and cultural pride. The winner would become the brand's ambassador, receive a scholarship, and feature in a national magazine. As students buzzed with excitement, Cordelia caught wind of the opportunity and immediately set her eyes on Jinika. This is your chance, she said, smoothing her daughter's hair. You have the body, the face. You were born for this. That Anulika will just embarrass us with her scars and bad luck. Jinika, full of vanity and pride, agreed instantly. I'll win, Mummy, she said confidently. I'll crush them. Chidinma cheered beside her, as if watching her own reflection win would bring validation. They printed application forms, booked studio photos, and even paid influencers to boost Jinika's online image. But quietly, in the silence of her suffering, Anulika applied too. Mrs. Benifo had told her about the contest weeks before it was officially announced. I want you to apply, she said firmly. Not for the crown, but for your voice. Anulika hesitated. I don't belong there, she replied. I don't even have clothes or shoes. And who will vote for someone like me? But her lecturer leaned in and whispered, you have something they don't. You have truth. Encouraged by her words, Anulika submitted her application using an old headshot and handwritten responses. She didn't expect a reply. She simply wanted to try, to remind herself she still had a choice in her own story. 2 weeks later, she received a letter. Congratulations. You've been selected as one of the finalists for the national pageant. Her hands shook as she read the words. For the first time in a long time, the world had seen her and chosen her. When Cordelia found out, rage painted her face red. You? You think you'll stand beside Jinika on a national stage? Are you mad? She tore the letter, but Anulika had already scanned a copy to her email. Cordelia tried to withdraw her application, but the organizers refused. The contest rules protected all selected finalists. Anulika would compete, and the girls? They panicked. Not because they believed Anulika would win, but because they feared what her presence might reveal. Her truth, her story, her scars. For weeks leading up to the pageant, they did everything to sabotage her. They locked her gowns in the wardrobe. They threw away her practice scripts. But still, she prepared. In the nights when they slept, she stood before a broken mirror, practicing her speech. And when the day finally came, the day of the pageant's final round, none of them knew that a pot of boiling water had already been set aside in Cordelia's kitchen. And that Cordelia was waiting for the right moment to make sure Anulika never stood on any stage again. It was the night before the final stage of the beauty pageant, an evening that should have been filled with last-minute rehearsals, excited jitters, and preparation for a life-changing moment. Instead, it turned into the darkest night of Anulika's life. After weeks of silent resistance and private determination, she had finally made it to the top 5 finalists. Her face was now on banners across the university. Though she wore borrowed clothes and had no glam team like Jinika, her intellect and charisma had made her stand out. Her story was already resonating, even though she hadn't yet spoken it aloud. Some of the organizers were beginning to notice her, not because of her beauty alone, but because of the quiet fire in her eyes. The way she walked on stage like someone who had carried storms in her chest and still stood tall. But that was what Cordelia feared most, not that Anulika might compete, but that she might win, that she might rise above them all and speak the truth. That evening, Anulika was in her room ironing her dress, a borrowed long ochre gown given to her by a classmate, when Cordelia called her into the kitchen. "Come and help me carry water," she said, voice unusually sweet. Anulika was cautious. Something in the woman's tone didn't sit right. But she obeyed, walking in barefoot. The kettle on the stove was whistling. The smell of hot vapor filled the air. Cordelia stood beside it with a wide basin and towel. "Carry this outside," she said. But as Anulika reached for the towel, Cordelia turned suddenly, her face twisted in hate. Without hesitation or warning, she flung the boiling kettle of water directly into Anulika's face. The scream that tore through her lungs wasn't human. It was animal, raw, primal, guttural. Her skin sizzled. Steam rose into the air as she collapsed, clutching her face and rolling on the cold tile. Jinika and Chidinma ran in, pretending to panic. It was an accident. Cordelia cried, pouring cold water on her. "She startled me." But even in her pain, Anulika knew it had been deliberate. The way Cordelia had smiled, the way she had stared directly into her eyes before throwing the water, it had been a choice. A cruel, calculated choice to destroy her. Anulika was rushed to the hospital, her face covered in white burns, skin peeling off in layers. Doctors rushed to manage the wounds, giving her painkillers that made her hallucinate. In her dreams, she saw her mother, soft eyes, a gentle voice saying, "You are still my daughter." But when she awoke, all she could feel was fire. Her face was wrapped in bandages, and every movement felt like a needle stabbing into her flesh. The nurse told her she wouldn't be able to compete. "They're announcing the winner tomorrow," she said, placing a hand gently on Anulika's bandaged arm. "Rest now." But Anulika didn't sleep. She lay there, every inch of her body in agony, her mind replaying Cordelia's smirk, Jinika's fake tears, and the truth she had fought so long to keep alive. In that sterile white room, she whispered the same vow she had made under the mango tree. "I won't die here." They had tried to kill her spirit, then her skin, but her soul, that would rise, scarred or not. While pain blurred the edges of her consciousness, one face remained clear through the haze, Obina's. He arrived at the hospital just past noon, carrying a flask of warm soup and a folded note. The moment he entered and saw her bandaged face, he stopped short, his eyes widening with horror and heartbreak. He didn't speak at first. He simply walked to her side and sat down, holding her bandaged hand in silence. She couldn't see his expression fully, but she felt the weight of his presence. He didn't flinch. He didn't recoil. He didn't look away. When she managed a pained whisper, "You shouldn't see me like this," he shook his head and said, "You're exactly who I came to see." And with those words, the tears she had bottled since the attack finally broke free, soaking her bandages, stinging her wounds. Obina gently dabbed her cheeks with tissue, careful not to press too hard. "They tried to break you," he said, voice low and fierce, "but they forgot who you are." Over the next few hours, Obina never left. He fed her tiny spoonfuls, told her jokes to distract from the pain, and read passages from her favorite book. "Do you remember this one?" he asked, opening her notebook, the one she thought had been lost. Inside were her poems, her declarations of survival. He had found it in her hostel and brought it with him. "You wrote this," he whispered, reading aloud a verse. "I may not wear gold, but I've survived the fire. My name is Ash, but I rise higher." When he finished, he looked up and said, "You're not done yet. You have to go there tomorrow." She turned her head slightly, her breath trembling. "Obina, look at me." He nodded. "I am." But she meant her face, the burns, the bandages, the ruined skin. She meant the scars that would follow her forever. But he refused to acknowledge them as limits. "You're still Anulika," he said, "and if you don't walk on that stage, they win. You're still the girl who turned pain into poetry. Go, even if they laugh, even if they stare. Let them see what they tried to destroy, and failed." That night, Anulika didn't sleep. Her wounds still burned. Her heart was a tangle of fear, humiliation, and anger. But beneath it all, something stirred, a quiet flame, the kind that pain cannot kill. The next morning, she asked the nurse for help dressing in something simple. She tied a scarf over her head and wore a flowing, long-sleeved dress. The bandages still covered her face, but her spine stood straighter than ever. When she stepped out of the hospital entrance, Obina was waiting with a car and a quiet smile. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "I was born ready. I just forgot for a while." As they drove toward the venue, Anulika clenched her fists on her lap. She didn't know what would happen, but she knew one thing: she would not hide anymore. If they wanted to see her, then they would see all of her. The auditorium was packed. Lights flashed. Cameras rolled. And the crowd buzzed with anticipation as the final 5 contestants were called to the stage. Jinika stood in a dazzling gold gown, her face painted to perfection, her lips fixed in a smug smile. Cordelia sat in the front row, her arms crossed confidently, already fantasizing about the press interviews and congratulatory parties. "They'll call her name any moment," she whispered to Chidinma. "That girl is history." But just as the host was about to announce the first runner-up, a hush spread through the room. Heads turned. Whispers erupted. There, at the back of the hall, Anulika appeared, wrapped in white bandages, dressed in a modest blue gown, eyes fierce behind gauze. Her steps were slow, deliberate, and though her face was hidden, her presence commanded silence. The judges looked stunned. The audience gasped. And Jinika's smile faltered for the first time that night. At first, some in the audience chuckled cruelly. "Who allowed her in? She should be home, not here. She looks like a mummy." Cordelia stood halfway, preparing to shout, but one of the judges raised his hand. "Let her come forward." And so she did, one step at a time, every step a defiance, every heartbeat a drum of resistance. When she reached the microphone, the host hesitated, unsure what to say. But Anulika didn't need an introduction. She simply said, "I was meant to be destroyed yesterday. I was meant to disappear. But I am still here, and I will answer your questions." The crowd murmured. Some rose to their feet. Others sat in stunned silence. The judges continued with the question and answer, and it was immediately clear. Jinika was only surface. When asked about cultural advocacy, Jinika babbled about fashion trends. Chidinma forgot the name of a female national hero. But when Anulika was asked how inner beauty could change the world, she answered with calm clarity. Because beauty that survives fire can never lie. What we survive defines our strength, not what we wear. By the time the final question was asked, the crowd was no longer mocking. They were clapping. The judges leaned in, nodding. Even the host looked moved. When the final decision came, the hall fell silent. The announcer's voice cracked as he said, "And the winner of the 2023 Beauty in Roots National Pageant is Anulika Okafor." Screams erupted. Some cried. Others stood in awe. Jinika dropped her bouquet and stormed off stage. Cordelia collapsed in her seat, face pale, muttering, "No, no, no." But Anulika simply stood there, crown trembling in the judge's hands, and received it with quiet dignity. Her bandages didn't hide her victory. They amplified it. Because in that moment, the world didn't see scars. They saw survival. They saw a girl who had been burned, betrayed, beaten, and still showed up. Still stood tall. Still won. And for the first time, Anulika didn't cry. She smiled, not because she had won a crown, but because she had proven she was never meant to be erased. After the cheers died down and the cameras turned off, Anulika stood backstage, still clutching the trophy. Her crown rested gently on her bandaged head, not just as a symbol of victory, but as a testimony to survival. Backstage staff whispered her name with reverence. Some were in tears. A makeup artist reached out and gently held her hand. "You reminded me of my sister," she said, voice cracking. "She died from acid burns. I wish she had lived to see this." But Anulika barely heard the words. Her body ached, her skin throbbed, but her mind was sharp, alive with the moment. She had walked into the pageant, disfigured, and walked out with a crown. And not because of pity, but because of strength. The judges had chosen her not for her appearance, but for her voice, for her heart, for the unwavering fire that no boiling water could quench. Jinika and Chidinma stormed out of the venue, trailed by Cordelia, who couldn't even look people in the eye. The cameras captured her stunned expression as reporters asked, "How does it feel knowing the girl you raised just won?" Cordelia shoved the microphone aside, muttering curses under her breath. She had poured boiling water, hoping to extinguish Anulika's flame, but instead, she had lit a wildfire. News outlets picked up the story that very night. Anulika's veiled photographs were everywhere: Instagram, Twitter, television. The caption read, "Crowned and scarred, the girl who redefined beauty." Strangers shared her speech. Burn survivors messaged from across the country. An NGO in Lagos pledged to sponsor her medical treatment. An anonymous donor paid for her mother's grave to be restored. The girl they once called a servant had become a national symbol of courage. That night, back in her hostel, Anulika sat by the window with the crown on her lap. The stars were unusually bright, and for the first time in years, the night felt gentle. Obinna sat across from her, smiling quietly. "I told you they'd see you," he said. She shook her head, laughing through her pain. "I didn't think they would," she whispered. "But they did." They talked for hours about everything and nothing. He told her about his younger sister who died of an illness when she was just 10, and how it shaped his passion for advocacy. She told him about her mother, how she used to sing Igbo lullabies at night and braid her hair under the mango tree. As they spoke, Anulika felt something she hadn't in years: connection. Not pity, not fear, just a bond formed between two broken, healing souls. She looked at him and whispered, "I'm not used to being seen not like this." Obinna replied gently, "Then get used to it. Because the world has finally opened its eyes." The following days were a whirlwind of attention and opportunity. Anulika was invited to appear on national TV. She wore a soft veil that revealed just one eye, and when the host asked why she chose not to remove it, she said, "Because my scars are not a weakness. They're a choice, a reminder. When I'm ready to show them, I will." That interview became one of the most shared in Nigerian media history. Journalists from abroad reached out. International magazines requested features. Girls across Africa reposted her photo with hashtags like #BeautyRedefined and #ScarsOfVictory. What Cordelia had meant to be shame had become glory. And Anulika carried it all with quiet grace. She didn't gloat. She didn't name names. But she let her silence become thunder. Cordelia watched in horror as her plan unraveled on national screens. People in the community began whispering. Some even stopped greeting her in the market. Her empire of fear had crumbled overnight. Meanwhile, Anulika continued building her legacy. With Obinna's help, she officially registered an NGO called Beauty in Ashes. Its mission: to provide counseling, legal support, and emergency funds for victims of domestic abuse, burn survivors, and abandoned girls. Obinna helped her secure funding from multiple sources: alumni associations, women's rights activists, and media houses. The first girl they helped was just 14, doused in hot oil by her aunt. She had wanted to die. But when Anulika visited her hospital bed and said, "I was you once," the girl clutched her tightly and cried for the first time in weeks. That night, Anulika went home and cried too. Not because she was sad, but because she was finally turning her pain into purpose. Every story she touched reminded her that her suffering hadn't been in vain, that the fire hadn't consumed her, it had refined her. With the NGO growing fast and sponsorship pouring in, doctors abroad reached out offering to conduct reconstructive surgery for free. It'll be a long process, they warned. Multiple stages and months of healing. But Anulika didn't flinch. She held Obinna's hand at the airport and said, "I'm ready. Not just for my face, but for my future." They flew out together, leaving behind the ashes of the past. Cordelia, hearing the news, grew paranoid. She began locking her doors at night. Neighbors ignored her in the streets. Jinika and Chidinma barely came home anymore. One evening, Cordelia stared into her mirror and whispered. She wasn't supposed to survive, but Anulika did. And now she was soaring, bandaged, yes. Scarred, yes. But soaring higher than they ever dreamed she could. And her face? That was just the beginning of what would be restored. America greeted Anulika not with pity, but with possibility. The hospital was modern, clean, filled with nurses who spoke softly and never stared. The doctors explained every step with patience: the grafts, the timelines, the pain levels. And yet, for Anulika, the emotional healing began long before the physical one. Each morning, Obina brought her tea and fresh flowers. They read books together, watched documentaries, and wrote down their dreams in a shared journal. One day, Obina said, "I want to open a shelter where no girl ever cries alone again." Anulika looked at him, her eyes still covered in gauze, and replied, "One day, I want to laugh without remembering pain." They made a pact to spend the rest of their lives helping others do the same. The surgeries were painful, layers of skin, nerve reconnections, sleepless nights, but Anulika never screamed. She bore it like a warrior, because now she had a mission, and it made every wound worth it. Over months, her face began to change. Not back to what it was, but forward into something new. A different beauty. One earned, not inherited. When the bandages were finally removed, Anulika stared at herself in the mirror and wept. Her reflection was no longer the girl who scrubbed toilets and served tea barefoot. It was a woman, healed, defined by her will, not her wounds. The doctor smiled and said, "You're whole again." But she shook her head and whispered, "I was whole before this. You just helped the world see it." She took pictures, not to flaunt, but to document. To say, "I was broken. Now I'm building." She sent one to Mrs. Benifo, who replied, "You've gone from a spark to a wildfire." Another was sent to the girl in the hospital back home, who posted it on her wall, saying, "If she can do it, so can I." And when the time came to return to Nigeria, Anulika didn't feel fear, only clarity. She wore a plain white dress and no makeup. She didn't need it. Her eyes told her story now. Obina stood beside her at the airport, suitcase in hand. "You ready to go home?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "I'm not going home," she said. "I'm going forward." And forward they went. Back to a nation waiting to hear her speak. Back to a house still filled with ghosts. Back to confront a woman who tried to destroy her. This time, not as a servant, not as a victim, but as Anulika Okafor, founder of Beauty in Ashes, survivor, symbol, and now judge. Because forgiveness is not forgetting, and justice was still a crown she had yet to place where it belonged. Returning to Nigeria was a surreal experience. When Anulika stepped off the plane, the air felt different, warmer, heavier, familiar, but no longer suffocating. Obina wheeled her suitcase beside her as they were greeted by a small crowd of journalists, NGO volunteers, and burn survivors who had come to welcome her. She didn't expect such a turnout. "The girl who came back whole," one of the placards read. But it wasn't her face they had come to see. It was her resilience. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, no veil, no makeup, just her glowing skin, and an even more radiant spirit. Her face still bore faint traces of the trauma, light scarring along the jawline, a slight shift in her smile, but it only added to her story. She smiled for cameras, gave hugs to strangers, and whispered encouragement to girls who reached out with trembling hands. When one girl asked, "Do you still feel pain?" Anulika nodded softly and said, "Yes. But now I know how to live with it." As she settled back into her new apartment, a quiet, two-bedroom space donated by a supporter of her NGO, Anulika reflected on how far she'd come. The room had pale yellow curtains, bookshelves filled with literature, and a window that overlooked a row of mango trees. Peaceful, unlike anything she had known before. She no longer woke up to the smell of kerosene or Cordelia's shouting. No more being called a mistake or a stain. Here, she was the master of her own story. Obina, ever present, had set up a small office space for the Beauty in Ashes Foundation. "It's time," he said one morning, handing her a stack of letters. "The girls are waiting. The nation is watching. And there's someone else who should be watching from behind bars." Anulika took the documents with a calm that surprised even her. Inside were police reports, medical files, photographs of her burns, and testimonies from witnesses. It was time to act. Not for revenge, but for justice. That week, she formally filed charges against Cordelia for attempted murder, child abuse, and domestic violence. With Obina and her lawyer, She submitted the case before a human rights tribunal and submitted video footage of Cordelia's abuse that had been secretly recorded by an old neighbor. Once the petition went public, social media exploded. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Anulika and hashtag Punish Cordelia trended across platforms. People began sharing their own stories, drawing strength from hers. Cordelia was summoned by the authorities. At first, she dismissed it, waving it off as jealousy and manipulation. But the case gained traction. Witnesses came forward, former housemaids, classmates, even a neighbor who remembered the night Anulika was locked out in the rain. Cordelia was arrested outside her church, hands cuffed in front of a congregation that once respected her. The woman who had once controlled Anulika's life now begged for hers. But Anulika wasn't watching from the shadows this time. She was seated calmly in the courtroom, head held high, waiting for the verdict. The crown wasn't on her head anymore, it was in her voice. The trial was one of the most talked about in recent local history. News vans camped outside the courthouse. Feminist activists and legal aid groups rallied behind Anulika, calling her case a symbol of suppressed domestic violence survivors. Cordelia's lawyer tried to present her as a misunderstood widow, claiming the water incident had been a tragic accident. She lost her husband. She was under pressure. The kettle slipped, he insisted. But the evidence was clear. Medical professionals testified about the nature of Anulika's burns, consistent with direct targeting. Neighbors spoke about screams heard for years. One woman tearfully described watching Anulika sweep the compound barefoot, with visible welts on her back. The court gasped when the secret video played, Anulika kneeling in gravel, while Jinica laughed and recorded. The judge narrowed his eyes. "Is this the happy family you described, Mrs. Cordelia?" She had no answer. Her hands trembled. Her daughters stared at their laps, unable to meet Anulika's gaze. But the most devastating blow came when Obinna submitted a signed medical affidavit proving deliberate poisoning in Mr. Okafor's tea. A former nurse who had once worked in the house finally spoke out. "She asked me to add white powder to his tea. She said it was stress medication. I knew something was wrong, but I was afraid of losing my job." The room fell silent. For years, Anulika had believed her father died of cowardice, but now she realized he'd been murdered slowly, just as she had been emotionally murdered each day. Cordelia's face went white. Jinica burst into tears. Even Chidinma looked like she had seen a ghost. The judge declared it a clear case of premeditated violence, abuse, and manipulation. Cordelia was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps filled the room. Jinica and Chidinma, though not imprisoned, were publicly shamed and banned from any state-funded scholarships or government jobs. Their names were stained. And yet, as they cried and begged Anulika outside the courthouse, she simply looked at them and said, "I forgive myself first. The rest is not my burden." That night, Anulika stood by the ocean with Obinna beside her. The wind kissed her face, no longer burning. "How do you feel?" he asked, watching her eyes search the horizon. "Free," she said. "Not healed, but free." He nodded. "That's a beginning." They didn't need to say more. The case was over. The justice had been delivered. But what meant more was the fact that Cordelia's power was gone. The fear that had once made Anulika cower had now dissolved into history. She had rewritten her own story, not with blood or fire, but with resilience, with poise, with truth. In a world where many scars are hidden, hers had led the way to light. And as she turned to walk away from the courthouse, reporters shouting her name and little girls waving signs, she whispered a single sentence to herself: "I am not what they did to me. I am what I became after." In the weeks following the trial, Anulika became a name etched into the soul of a nation. Invitations flooded in: interviews, keynote speaking events, TEDx talks, human rights conferences. She attended them all, not for fame, but for the girls who still slept on cold floors, the girls whose names were never heard, whose scars never made the news. Her presence was commanding. No longer the quiet, frightened servant. She now stood before thousands, speaking with conviction and compassion. We live in a world that punishes the wounded, she said in one speech, "but I am here to say, your pain is not your shame. It's your proof of survival." Every word was a mirror for someone in the audience. Girls cried. Mothers wept. Fathers lowered their heads in remorse. Her NGO grew into a movement. Beauty in Ashes opened 3 more shelters across the country, offering food, refuge, therapy, and legal support. And still, she never forgot who she was. Anulika returned to her old neighborhood one quiet afternoon. She walked past the gate where she had once been locked out in the rain, past the orange tree where she used to study with a torchlight. The mango tree still stood in the backyard, the one under which she buried her father's last shirt. She knelt there, dug a little, and found the earth still tender. She whispered, "I kept my promise." No longer did she need validation from ghosts. Her spirit had long moved past that. And, as she stood, a girl from a neighboring house came running up to her. "Auntie Anulika," she cried, "I want to be strong like you." Anulika crouched, brushed the dust from the girl's cheeks, and replied, "Then never let anyone tell you silence is strength. Your voice is your sword." And with that, she handed the girl a copy of her speech, now printed and framed, and walked away with the wind behind her. Jinika and Chidinma attempted to reach her once more. They sent letters, emails, messages through mutual friends. "Please forgive us. We were children. We didn't know what we were doing. We were just afraid of our mother." But Anulika didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but because she had let go. She had no room for people who only remembered her humanity after the world did. Obina, ever supportive, never pressured her. "Forgiveness is an ode," he said one evening. "It's offered, and sometimes withheld." She nodded, grateful. They sat on the orphanage porch, watching children chase each other with laughter. Laughter she once thought she'd never hear again. And, in the hum of the evening, she whispered, "They burned my face, but they couldn't burn my name." She leaned her head on Obina's shoulder. Not lovers. Not yet. But soul-deep companions. The kind who had risen from ruins and turned their ashes into wings. The months that followed were golden, not because Anulika was free from pain, but because she had learned to grow through it. She had become more than a symbol. She was now a beacon. International organizations reached out, inviting her to speak on panels and participate in policy drafts that would protect young girls and women from domestic abuse and gender-based violence. Her words were no longer just speeches. They were shaping national conversations. Government officials, who once ignored victims, now quoted her in their campaigns. She appeared on magazine covers with the headline, "The Woman They Couldn't Destroy." Her face, once hidden beneath layers of gauze and shame, now graced posters, classrooms, and conferences. Students began requesting her biography. Teachers read her story to inspire courage in young girls. And through it all, Anulika remained grounded, still choosing simplicity over spectacle, truth over noise. She traveled with Obina to visit villages where girls had no access to school or safe homes. In each place, she left more than donations. She left dignity. Girls clung to her dress as she hugged them. Women wept as they heard her story. And in every face she met, she saw reflections of her past self, silent, scared, scarred. One girl named Deborah asked her, "Auntie Anulika, what if I'm too broken to become anything?" Anulika knelt, took her hands, and replied, "Then you're just the right material for building something strong." That line became the slogan of Beauty in Ashes, now a nationwide foundation with shelters in 6 states, legal aid clinics, and scholarship programs. Survivors began to reclaim their voices. Anulika gave them platforms. She trained them, mentored them, and empowered them to tell their own truths. Her impact rippled like waves, and the world noticed. Despite the fame, Anulika never returned to the mansion where her scars were born. Cordelia remained in prison, her name forgotten by the same society she once controlled. Jinika and Chidinma faded into obscurity, moving far away to escape the weight of their shame. And Anulika? She blossomed without ever needing their validation. She no longer looked at her reflection with sorrow. Her new face was different, yes, but it was hers. It bore the signature of survival. And it was beautiful. She often told girls, beauty isn't what survives the mirror. It's what survives the fire. People asked if she'd ever consider writing a book, or entering politics, or launching a brand. But Anulika smiled and always replied the same. I don't need more crowns. I only needed one, and I've already earned it. That crown wasn't jeweled. It wasn't metallic. It was invisible, yet undeniable. It sat firmly on the head of the woman who was once called worthless, but now stood taller than any throne they ever tried to deny her. The sun was soft that morning, peeking through the windows of the new beauty in Ash's orphanage. Children's laughter echoed in the halls. There were drawings on the walls, colorful books in every room, and a small garden where flowers bloomed despite the dry soil. Anulika stood near the swing set, her dress simple, her hair braided and tucked behind her ears. She was watching a little girl teach another how to plant hibiscus seeds when Obina walked up beside her, carrying a box of new school shoes. They're already fighting over who gets to wear pink first, he chuckled. She smiled warmly. Good. Let them fight over beauty, now, not for survival. It had been a long journey, one that began with silence and ended with a sanctuary. This place was her final vow to every girl who had ever felt unloved. You belong, was the message etched above every bedpost. And this time, no one would dare tell them otherwise. Later that afternoon, they held a small event on the orphanage grounds. Girls performed poems and songs they'd written, inspired by Anulika's story. One shy girl recited, they burned her skin, but she healed her world. Her crown came from courage, not diamonds. The crowd applauded. Obina stood in the back, watching Anulika with quiet pride. He had loved her for years now, not romantically, but reverently. He had watched her rise, not with ego, but with grace. And now, as she hugged children and shook hands with guests, he realized something. She had rebuilt a world from ashes, and he had been privileged to witness it. After the guests left, he approached her with a quiet smile. You've changed everything, he said. Even me. She looked at him and nodded. And you saved me when I forgot who I was. There were no declarations, no grand love story, but between them was something deeper, shared healing, deep trust, and a friendship that time couldn't touch. As evening fell, Anulika took a walk around the garden. She paused by the hibiscus plot, ran her fingers through the fresh soil, and closed her eyes. The breeze whispered through the trees like a lullaby. In that moment, she didn't think of Cordelia, or the boiling water, or the grave of her father. She thought of her mother's song, the one she used to hum under the mango tree. She sang it softly now, voice steady, heart whole. For the first time in her life, Anulika felt complete. Not because her scars were gone, but because they no longer owned her. She was not the girl they tried to break. She was the woman who stood, because they tried. As stars bloomed across the sky, she whispered to herself, "This is the crown I was meant to wear." And finally, she rested, not in pieces, but in peace. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.